tell me, in your work now around self-worth and unconditional worthiness, how do you define those terms?
So I think of self worth as being based on how you see yourself, how you treat yourself, and how you feel about yourself. I see self worth more as your relationship with yourself, I like to say, how you be in the world than what you do in the world. A lot of us think about self esteem, and I think of self esteem more as what we do, our abilities, our accomplishments, what we think we can achieve. And self worth is more like, how am I showing up? What's my energy? How am I treating myself? How am I seeing myself? That sort of thing. And then I define unconditional self worth as the belief that you deserve to be alive, to be loved and cared for, and to take up space just because you're human.
Welcome to the Gen X Shift podcast, a show for Gen Xers who are navigating some pretty tough transitions and aren't sure how to move forward. I'm your host, Michele Walter, proud Gen Xer, former lawyer turned entrepreneur, huge Jason Momoa fan, and margarita snob. And I've navigated a lot of transitions in my life, from losing my mom suddenly to a heart attack to starting my own business. But I often did it all on my own because I was too stubborn to ask for help. Now I'm on a mission to give actionable strategies to other Gen Xers so that they can find the confidence, courage, and clarity they need to make a shift. So let's rock and roll. Hey, Gen Xers, welcome back to the podcast. This week, I'm bringing you a very special conversation with Dr. Adia Gooden. Dr. Adia has been instrumental over the past few years for me to start to do the work around fully embracing my unconditional self-worth. Now, there might be a lot of Gen Xers out there listening to this who have a bit of a visceral reaction to terms like self-worth and self-acceptance and self-love. I get it. I hear you. I used to be that person too. And I'm here to tell you that if you are someone who is having trouble making any kind of shift in your life, no matter what it is, not embracing your unconditional self-worthiness is going to be at the root of it. I guarantee you. I first found Dr. Adia a few years ago, and before I even met her one-on-one, I got familiar with her work and doing this healing around fully embracing my unconditional self-worth. And it's still a journey. It's a lot of unlearning, a lifetime of habituated patterns and conditionings that I am unlearning that have impacted my thinking that I am not worthy as a human being. And the big takeaway from this conversation with Dr. Adia is that you are unconditionally worthy because you are a human being who is here right now listening to this podcast. We get into the topics of imposter syndrome, perfectionism, forgiveness, self-forgiveness particularly, and trauma, and how all of those relate to our notions about whether or not we feel worthy as a human being. This is a jam-packed conversation. We cover a lot of territory that I think is going to be really impactful for people of our generation who haven't done this work around fully accepting your self-worth, knowing and trusting that no matter what you do, no matter how much you work, no matter how much you try to be perfect, that it doesn't matter because you are worthy no matter what. If you're somebody who prides yourself on being a workaholic, pride yourself on being a perfectionist, I know you're out there, I know you're listening, then this episode might open your eyes a little bit into how that is not serving and supporting you. And how if you're somebody who prides yourself on that kind of productive, workaholic, perfectionist work ethic or lifestyle, you want to start to get really curious about what are you afraid of it will say about you if you don't work that much, if you're not a perfectionist. Because at the root of it is a notion that you are not unconditionally worthy, that your worth is conditioned on these external factors, on how much you produce, how much you do, how much you accomplish, how much you achieve, how much you people please, how much you serve other people. When at the end of the day, if you're sitting on the couch watching Netflix, you are just as worthy as the person who is working 80 hours a week and supporting a family. So this conversation might be a little triggering for some of y'all, and that's a good thing. I invite you to lean into that discomfort. Get really curious about how the lack of self-worth is showing up in your life and what your life might look like if you started to embrace your unconditional self-worthiness. So enjoy this conversation with Dr. Adia, and I'll see you on the other side.
Hey, Dr. Adia, welcome to the Gen X Shift. I'm really grateful to have you here, and I'm excited for this conversation and to get to share your wisdom around a lot of really important topics that I feel a lot of people of my generation, at least, may not be paying too much attention to, like our self-worth and imposter syndrome and perfectionism. So we're going to get into all of that today. So thank you for being here.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm excited. Looking forward to our
Yeah.
conversation.
Well, and I have to reveal right off the bat that you are not a Gen Xer, which is absolutely okay. You know, at the end of the day, they're all just labels. And I will give you an honorary Gen X hall pass for the day, as I like to say when I
Thank
have
you.
other millennials on the podcast, because as I've said before, it's my hope that Gen X can be kind of a bridge between the generations and that we can not get
Mm,
so wrapped up in a lot of the blame and shame that goes on nowadays between generations,
mm,
which I don't think is helpful. And I think each generation has a lot to learn from the other. So,
I love that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
I'm an elder millennial.
yeah,
Definitely elder, but I appreciate the hall pass.
yeah. Just for today, and then we'll revoke it after this podcast. But so I want to let folks know how I know you, how I came to know of the genius and wisdom that you are. And I was trying to remember back this morning when I was thinking about it. I don't know exactly how long ago it was. And it was either your TED Talk, you have a TED Talk called Cultivating Unconditional Self-Worth, which I'll link that in the show notes. And you have a course on the app Insight Timer around imposter syndrome. And it was one of those two things that I found somehow and listened to them, took the course on Insight Timer, and was just blown away by your take on how self-worth is at the root of so many things in our life. And for me, I look at that through the lens of lack of self-worth being at the root of maybe why it's hard for Gen Xers to make transitions in their life. And so after I was following you for a long time, I follow you a lot on Instagram. You have amazing Instagram posts and reels and insights that you share all the time. I took a group program of yours. Was that last year? I don't even remember.
No, it's the year before. Yeah, this was fall 2022.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
fall 2022.
Whew.
Time
Yeah. Time
flies.
flies. Yeah. But that group program was amazing. So many awesome women in that group program. And I loved how you facilitated it. So long story short, I've been a big fan for several years. And so I feel very grateful to get to share this space with you today. Because I think this topic of self-worth and imposter syndrome and perfectionism are going to really plant some seeds for folks to get curious about how those are showing up in their lives. So I want to rewind a little bit to have you give us a little bit of your backstory so that we can understand how you got involved in being a therapist. You have a PhD in clinical community psychology from DePaul University, and how that led you to the work that you're doing now as a therapist and as a coach in helping people, especially women, find their unconditional worthiness. So tell us a little bit about what life was like for you growing up.
It's a good question. So, let's see. Life in general, like I had a good life growing up. Like I grew up middle, might say upper middle class. Both of my parents are actually clinical psychologists and were professors, like in that kind of went the academic route. So like pretty sort of like calm, stable upbringing. I lived in the same house from 3 till I went to college, right? So there were a lot of things that were privileges, and, blessings and things that I grew up with. And on the inside, I often really struggled with loneliness, with feeling left out, with feeling unworthy and like I wasn't good enough. And that was a combination of some of the dynamics in my family. And just always sort of feeling othered in friendships and friend groups. And I went to some really cool, small, like hippie, I call them elementary schools in California. Well, it was really just one because I was in the same place from K through 8th, like a very, very stable life, which I'm grateful for. But I still, even though it was super small, there would be times when like there were 24 people in our class, in our grade, and I would be the only one. Actually, there were fewer than that in our grade, like 15, and I would be the only one not invited to a party, right? Like that kind of thing would happen. And I was also the only or one of very few Black girls in that space. So there were just all of these things that made me feel like something was wrong with me, like I wasn't good enough. And you know, when you also mentioned like the origins of me going into clinical psychology, you know, part of that is because of my parents, but not because they were like, you should be a clinical psychologist, more because I saw them model it as a possibility and something that they enjoyed. But then there was also an element of like, I always deeply loved and deeply cared about people. And I was always sort of, I think probably because I felt like I was on the outside, sort of curious about people who weren't included, people who were left behind. I always wanted to include people. I was reading, I probably shouldn't have read this book in 8th grade, but I remember reading this book called Rosalie. And it was like, an autobiography of this woman in DC who had been addicted to heroin and became homeless. And like I just was, and I think I was like 13 when I read that, but it just touched me so deeply. And this idea that like everyone deserves love and care and is valuable and worthy. Like I probably couldn't have articulated it then, but it is something that I felt pretty deeply. So that was sort of like my origins. And of course, like I was like a preteen trying to figure it out. And that evolved into more sort of like perfectionism, trying to prove that I was good enough, trying to prove that I was worthy, overworking, overextending, trying to do all the things, all this energy and stress and, you know, output, and really going on this achievement path through high school and then into college. You know, my dad helped me figure out that I wanted to do clinical psychology because I loved helping kids, youth. I like tutoring. I like doing those things, but I didn't really want to be a teacher. And so it turns out clinical psychology was a great fit for me in a lot of ways. But one of the things that I never really loved about it, and I still don't love about it, is the pathologizing and the focus more on what's wrong with people than what's right with people. And so my research was often focused on thriving for African American adolescents. That was what my dissertation was on. Or like, what are the things in community and individuals that help them to do well? And so that combined with my own struggles with self-worth. And then when I started seeing young adults, adolescents, seeing like, oh, I'm not the only one who struggles with this self-worth stuff. Lots of people struggle with it. Me seeing that, because I worked at a university counseling center, so super high achieving young adults who were struggling with their worth, that all sort of combined for me to start thinking about and talking about this idea of unconditional self-worth.
Thanks for sharing that journey. And I want to let folks know too, we're going to talk about this a little bit. You share some of that in the free download that you have for folks that I'll put a link in the show notes. That's called 4 Practices to Get Started on Your Self-Worth Journey. And you share some of that story in that download. And I was really touched when I read that story because I think it's a pretty common one, especially for people who are pretty sensitive, like highly sensitive people. Do you feel like you're a highly sensitive person?
That's a good question. I don't know if I identify myself that way. When I read the descriptions, I'm like, oh yeah, some of it. I would say like I am very sensitive to what other people are feeling, like the energy, things like that. But I don't get dysregulated with it. So I think that is when I hear people talk about being highly sensitive, I often feel like there's an element of like it's dysregulating and it's overwhelming and it's flooding. And so I don't have that piece of it. So I do feel very sensitive and connected to people and their struggles and their suffering, but I don't have the element of like feeling just like flooded by it and overwhelmed and dysregulated, or like walking into a space where there's lots and lots of people and just feeling like, oh my gosh, there is so much going on here and I can't manage it.
That's a good distinction. And I do identify as a highly sensitive person, and that's not something that I realized until the last few years ago. And especially related to the last part that you said, like walking into a room and feeling like my nervous system is a beacon for everybody else's nervous systems. So yeah, I think for me, that highly sensitive label, and again, I'm kind of careful about pathologizing and sort of labeling everything too. And I think it can provide a useful frame of reference for understanding my reactions to situations. Like, why am I getting so upset or overwhelmed? Why do I feel like a sponge for everybody else's emotions? So, but just coming back to your story, and as when you said, as a little girl that you would be the only one who didn't get invited to parties, that just hit so hard, because my mom was always the mom that said, you are inviting everybody to your parties. Nobody is going to be excluded. And at the time as a kid, I'm like, really, mom? I got to invite like the little booger eater in the class? And she's like, yes, you invite the little booger eater. And now in hindsight, we see how important that is, because as little kids, and I think even before we're little kids, and I kind of want to circle back to this and talk about some trauma relationship with self-worth. But as from little kids, we start getting peppered with these messages of you're other, you're different, you don't belong. And then we internalize that as not having our own unconditional worthiness, our self-worth. So I want to start, let's actually lay a foundation here, and tell me, in your work now around self-worth and unconditional worthiness, how do you define those terms?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think of self-worth as being based on how you see yourself, how you treat yourself, and how you feel about yourself. I see self-worth more as your relationship with yourself, I like to say, how you be in the world than what you do in the world. A lot of us think about self-esteem, and I think of self-esteem more as what we do, our abilities, our accomplishments, what we think we can achieve. And self-worth is more like, how am I showing up? What's my energy? How am I treating myself? How am I seeing myself? That sort of thing. And then I define unconditional self-worth as the belief that you deserve to be alive, to be loved and cared for, and to take up space just because you're human.
I'm just letting that sink in, because that is a constant growth edge for me, and I think for a lot of people, to believe that you are worthy just because you are alive and you are here and you are human. And that's the unconditional piece of it. And I appreciate that you made that distinction between unconditional worthiness, self-worthiness, and self-esteem, because it sounds like what I hear in that is self-esteem is what we get from more external factors and validation and accomplishment. And that can be conditional. Whereas unconditional self-worth is a deeply rooted, unshakable foundation. So what impact does it have for somebody when they can start to live their life from a place of unconditional self-worth, as opposed to low self-worth or depending on self-esteem and external factors?
I love that question. I mean, I really believe that when we have that foundation of unconditional self-worth, that's when we can fully show up, shine, be our full selves in the world, be courageous, and do what we really feel called to do in this world, right? It takes a lot of courage to follow our own path, to speak up, to share our gifts, right? Like that's a vulnerable thing. And I think often we are distracted or preoccupied by trying to prove that we are worthy by all of these external standards, right? Prove that we're smart enough, prove that we work hard enough, prove that we're good enough, prove that we have enough money, prove that whatever. We're trying to prove all of these things. And ultimately that distracts us from what we are here to do. And there may be pieces of what we're here to do that get caught up in the achievement, that it may not be wholly separate. But I think that when we know we're worthy, then we just start doing what we want to do. We start doing what we're here to do. We start showing up, shining. We stop hiding, and we're less likely to be competitive in a negative and unhealthy way. We're less likely to, put ourselves down. We're more likely to be in healthy relationships and create healthy connection and community. And so I see it as I wouldn't say the only, but a foundation for really living a healthy and holistic life where you're contributing and you have a sense of meaning and purpose.
One thing I get really curious about for myself, and that I hear sometimes from other people when we're talking about our own self-worth and self-compassion, and I want to come back to that too, is a couple of things. First of all, if I'm somebody who believes that I am unconditionally worthy, isn't that going to make me super egotistical or arrogant or a narcissist? And the second thing is, well, what if I am unconditionally self-worthy and believe in myself and that I just deserve to be here, and then I'm not actually doing anything? Because if I don't have all the boxes to check and all the things to prove, then what am I going to do with my life? You mean to tell me that I'm just as worthy if I sit on the couch and watch Netflix 24/7 as somebody who has 2 kids and is working 3 jobs? So on those two objections, for lack of a better word, to self-worth, what would your response be?
I love these objections and addressing them.
Because I am an attorney, right? So I'm going to make objections.
So with the first one, right, with this fear that I will be narcissistic, I will be navel gazing, I will just be so caught up in myself, I think it's really important to clarify that unconditional self-worth is not about being better than anyone. Right. So it's not saying I'm unconditionally worthy, but you have all those conditions and you better get that together while I go look at myself in the mirror like Narcissus and just like think I'm amazing. Right. That's not what it's saying. It is saying I am unconditionally worthy. And if you want to take it a step further, so are you, so is everyone. Like everyone is unconditionally worthy. Right. So it's really not about, it's not even about like hyping yourself up and saying, I'm just the most amazing person in the world. I'm the most beautiful. You can hype yourself up. That's great. But it's not about comparison. It's not about saying I am more worthy. And that's really the game we are playing in self-esteem and in conditional self-worth. I've got to be more worthy than the next person to prove that I should be here. I got to be better than the next person. I got it right. Or sometimes on the opposite end, we think I'm worse than everybody. That's kind of another way our ego can operate. Either we're better than or we're worse than. And unconditional self-worth is really asking you to step outside of that zero-sum game and into a belief that I am unconditionally worthy and so is everyone else. And that doesn't mean that I'm just going to stare in the mirror, but it means I'm going to get on with the business of what I'm here to do, right? Like, what are you here to do? That what brings meaning and purpose to your life? Like, let's do that, right? Not do the career that your parents said was going to be the only honorable one that you now hate and are miserable and, have Sunday scaries every Sunday, right? But like, do what you are here to do on this world because you're worthy of that, right? That's the energy of it. And then on the other end, I think what I would suggest or what I would ask is, do you really want to just watch Netflix all day? Like, and maybe the answer is yes in the short term. And my guess is that yes answer comes from burnout, comes from trauma, comes from exhaustion, comes from spending decades trying to prove that you're worthy, figuring out it doesn't work and feeling hopeless about it, versus coming from a true desire, right? A true having a sense of meaning and purpose. Because the truth is that when we feel alive, we have a sense of meaning and purpose. I don't think people truly desire, unless your like job and your purpose in this world is to like critique movies and TV shows and you're watching and then you're like giving your critiques and whatever, right? But like, I don't actually,
Which is great.
Which is great, right? Like, but and maybe you need a period of rest where you are not doing anything because you need to recover from burnout or overwork or whatever it is. But my guess is that after a period of true rest, your deep desire is not going to be to sit on the couch and do nothing forever. Maybe you'll want to
Mm-hmm.
do that a little bit. Maybe you'll want to do it more, and you will do it more than you did before. Because, hey, most of us, and I'm going to venture to say most Gen Xers probably need more rest than you've allowed yourself to have, right? So you probably will want to do it, but then you're probably going to start to say, well, I want to do something with these thoughts I have, these gifts I have, these, right? And so my belief is that knowing that you're worthy would help you get back to that, right? And that you wouldn't feel fulfilled and happy and joyful and like you're living a meaningful life by watching Netflix for the rest of your life just because you believe you're worthy.
Dr. Adia, rest is a 4-letter word for Gen Xers. For most Americans, as a matter of fact. I'm really glad you brought that up, though, and I want to come back to what you just said. So I'm trying to keep track in my head because my brain fires at 50 miles an hour. So on the rest piece, especially for Gen Xers, and I think for a lot of people that live in a westernized society, as we do, that the concept of rest is very antithetical to what it means to be a productive member of society, or to be an American, or to be the breadwinner, or to be a good mom or a good dad or a good parent or a good partner, a good employee, like all those things, because we think that we have to go, 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 go. And it comes back to what you said, in order to prove that we're worthy as fill in the blank. And so for people, especially of my generation, who really buck that notion of getting more rest and slowing down, can you give us some insight into how it would actually make our lives better if we were to embrace our self-worth and therefore trust that it's okay to rest?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I have a few thoughts. So one is, let's just acknowledge that, yes, it's scary, right? That I was actually having a conversation with my mom, who's a boomer,
Mm-hmm.
a couple days ago. She was in town about like me being in this process of resetting my nervous system such that rest feels safe,
Oh,
such that
huge.
slowness
That's
and
huge.
ease feels safe. Because I am an elder millennial. I like overworked for years. Both of my parents overwork. My mom is a self-proclaimed workaholic, right? So what happens is then working and always being in motion and always being busy feels safe, right? Like that feels like safety, and it feels very scary not to be in that mode and to rest, right? It feels like a threat. It feels like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm going to lose my job, lose my house, lose my, right? Like it doesn't feel safe. And so the first thing is to just be really patient and compassionate around the fact that this is a pretty radical shift from always working, producing, doing, and into doing a little bit less of that and a little bit more rest. So that's one. We could take this, there's a lot of research on sleep, literally, about, we solidify memories, right? More sleep, getting enough sleep or not getting enough sleep is linked to Alzheimer's, heart attack, stroke, heart disease, diabetes, right? Like there is a plethora of physical health issues that certainly are widespread in the US, way more than other countries, that are like linked to literally not getting enough sleep. So that's like, we could take that one level. Let's take another level, which is, I know when I don't get enough sleep, I am not the most pleasant person. I am
Me
certainly
neither.
not the most patient person. Right? And so our relationships, right? Like everything, we get irritable, we get anxious, we get depressed, right? Like there are lots of mental health issues. There are interpersonal challenges that come from not getting sleep. And then let's look at, since productivity is a piece, like most of us are not nearly as productive on less sleep as we are on getting enough sleep. And by the way, enough is like 7 to 9 hours for most of us adults, right? But when we don't get enough sleep, we can't concentrate, we can't focus. And so then what do? We spend all day working and not getting very much done, and then criticizing ourselves. So there's a lot of layers around the beauty and the power of rest and sleep. And I think when we know that we're worthy beyond our productivity, that helps us to give ourselves permission to take that rest, even when we are transitioning into it and it is scary and our nervous system feels like this isn't safe. But if we can remind ourselves, I am still worthy when I'm resting, I am still worthy when I'm not doing anything productive, then that helps to soothe us so that we can practice the rest. And then on the other side, see the benefits of like, oh, I actually didn't work all weekend. And then Monday didn't feel so bad. And I got my work done quicker. And I didn't, yell at my kid, or I didn't, whatever it is. Right. And so the self-worth can be this foundation that helps us to ease gently into increasing rest. And then the rest will be reinforcing because we'll feel the benefits.
That's so powerful. And I want to get from you a sense of what would be one question or one mantra that someone could say to themselves in those moments when they notice, I can't rest, there's too much to do, I got to keep going. What would be one place that they could start to sort of bring themselves into everything that you just talked about?
I guess maybe it's like a two-part phrase, like I am worthy of rest and the world will not fall apart when I'm resting.
That's awesome. I am worthy of rest and the world will not fall apart when I'm resting. I'm just thinking of all of my friends whose heads are exploding as they listen to that, because they don't believe it, right? They don't believe it. And it comes back to so much of what you said about our nervous systems not feeling safe, not only to rest, but safe to believe in our own self-worth so that we don't have to be productive, check all the boxes, meet everybody else's expectations, all of those things. And so there's a couple of people coming to mind in particular, attorneys, big surprise, who, if you tell them the world will not stop turning if you rest, or if you take a vacation, or if you don't do all of the things on your list, they literally don't believe it. So take me through, because we're talking here about essentially unlearning a lifetime of conditioning and behaviors, right? So when somebody first comes to you, how do you begin? What's your process? And I know that is going to be based on the individual, but just in general, what's your process for working with people to start to unlearn that their worthiness is conditional and relearn that they're unconditionally worthy?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I have sort of like I have a framework that has 3 core sort of processes that I help move people through when I'm helping them connect to their unconditional self-worth. And the first is free yourself. And that really is about freeing yourself from the stories that you've been told about who you are, the stories you've told yourself, these beliefs, these conditions, right? Like all of these conditions that you have put on your worth, or that society has put on your worth, or that your family has put on your worth. And so some of the like kind of thought exercises are, would you think your friend was worthy if they took a vacation? Right? Like sort of like shifting away, because often we think very differently about other people and what makes them worthy or unworthy than ourselves, right? And so I would really doubt that most of us, if we were thinking, I can't take a vacation, I haven't done enough work, or I can't go to sleep because I haven't finished my to-do list and I'm up, like we're getting caught up in that. And then we ask, okay, well, what if your friend was coming to you with the exact same situation and said, I don't know if I'm going to be worthy if I don't finish my to-do list, or I don't know if I'm going to be worthy if I stop work before 7 p.m., whatever it is. You'd be like, that's crazy. Of course you're worthy. Like, what? Right? Like it would be a no-brainer, right? And so some of it is like starting to create some space, right? Because often we're if you can't see my hands, I have like clasped my hands together with the fingers interwoven. Like we are very tight with these beliefs. Like we cannot see beyond them. They are the truth. They are our truth. And it feels like a threat to let them go. And so part of the work that we're doing is like, how do we loosen it up? And I'm opening my fingers. Like, how do we just start to create a little bit of space between ourselves and these beliefs that we've adopted? And some of those beliefs have been survival strategies, right? Like we survived our childhood, our high school, our college, our law school, grad school, whatever, we survived by believing this and operating under that condition and belief. And so now is this opportunity to shift things and see things differently. And at the very least, actively choose, right? So like, I'm not saying I have to work till midnight. I am choosing to work till midnight. And that just starts to shift things. I think the other thing I help people do is like, can you start to experiment, right? So you mentioned your friends, like they would never believe it. Okay, like what if we did an experiment, right? Like what if for 1 week you stopped work at 6 p.m. no matter what? And they might be like, right? Like,
Yeah.
but like, could you be like a researcher and try it out and see? Because the only way we're going to help you have the experience that the world will not stop when you rest is you resting and then seeing that the world did not stop. Everything did not fall apart. You did not get fired, right? All of those things. So you actually have to be willing to test things out and believe the actual data of your experience over what your mind says is true, which is often not based on real data.
What's so critical about what you said is that we have to be our own experiment. Because for a lot of people, especially when we're talking attorneys, doctors, like these, white collar professions, believe that this workaholism, go has served them. That were it not for that, they wouldn't be where they are. They wouldn't be making the money. They wouldn't have the title. And so it comes back to what you were saying about feeling safe enough to slow down and rest. And so in order to do that, because you've built up this lifetime of quote evidence that this has worked for you. So now you need to build up evidence almost to the contrary, that something else can work even better for you, and I don't even like that comparison of better, but can feel better, feel more supportive for you. And that doesn't mean that you have to blow up your whole life or that you have to lose your job or not make as much money, but just be your own experiment and get curious about doing things incrementally differently. So I really appreciate that message. Tell me how I think one of the biggest things I hear from a lot of my clients, and myself included, is perfectionism. So tell me how perfectionism feeds into our lack of self-worth.
Often within perfectionism, there's this belief that if I am just perfect, then I will be worthy, I will be loved, I will be accepted, right? If I just do everything perfect and I am perfect, then my life will be okay. I will be happy. I will be connected. I will be loved. I will be successful. I will get the promotion, right? So there's all of these things with perfection as a prerequisite for the many things that we want in life: love, connection, acceptance, success, all of those things, right? The irony of perfectionism is that it often takes us away from those very things that we want, right? It takes us away from love, right? And acceptance, because it's really hard to experience true love and acceptance when you're hiding the shadow parts of yourself, when you're hiding the parts of yourself that aren't perfect, right? Because then people love you and accept you. And you're like, but if you really knew me, you'd reject me. You don't know about that thing I did 10 years ago. You don't know about those skeletons in the closet. So you don't really know me, right? So we actually block ourselves from that. And so self-worth, the hope is that when you know you're unconditionally worthy, you can release some of the need for perfectionism, right? And instead, you can focus on, what are my gifts? What are my strengths? What am I here to contribute? Like, what am I here to do? And can I do it imperfectly, right? And still have the impact and still be loved and still be accepted and still be successful, right? Perfectionism also connects to this challenge of rest that we're talking about, because I see it as sometimes manifesting as overworking, right? Like if I'm just always working, always working, then maybe I'll get it right. Maybe I'll get it perfect. Maybe I'll never make a mistake or never miss anything, right? So that's the overwork. And sometimes perfectionism manifests as procrastination, right? And then people feel that they're lazy. Well, I'm just so lazy. I couldn't let myself rest more. I'm not doing anything all day. I'm just playing games on my phone, or I'm just watching whatever. And it's actually not laziness. It's actually this fear of starting because you're worried that you can't do it perfectly if and when you start, right? And so perfectionism can really drive a lot of these challenges and this feeling of stuckness. And what we really need to do is just say, I'm worthy even when I'm not perfect. I'm worthy. And when I'm not perfect, I am still worthy. I can have an impact. I can be successful. I can be loved. I can be accepted. Even when I'm imperfect, even when I get things wrong, even when I make mistakes, etc.
Yeah. 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 Thank you for that, because perfectionism is such a point of pride for so many people. So is the workaholism, it all creates this like toxic cocktail of people having these unhealthy, unsupportive behaviors for themselves that they think have been working for them and that they pride themselves on. Like people, it's just so interesting to me how, especially in this country, because of I think the systems of oppression that have been in place since the inception of this country, that we get the notion that we want to be proud of. I'm a perfectionist. I'm a workaholic. I work 80 hours a week. What is that about? Like,
I mean,
that
it's
drives
capitalism
me nuts.
internalized. It is capitalism internalized.
It is. It absolutely is.
And it's a
And
booby
that kind of,
prize.
it's,
Right? Instead of
oh my
happiness and
God.
joy and connection and love and meaning, I'm perfect. I work all the time. I blah, blah, blah. Like,
It is a booby prize. I love that phrase, because it is. It's just a load of crap. And then there's the reverse of that too, or maybe not reverse, but like the martyrdom side of that, the victim side. There's some people who really pride themselves on that and puff up their chest. I'm a perfectionist and it's my way or the highway, and I work 80 hours a week and you should too, otherwise you're worthless. And then there are the people on the other side of the coin who are like, God, I have to work 80 hours a week. Like, I have to make things perfect. I have to. So the martyrdom, along with the egotism and the pride, at the root of all of that is this fear that if you don't, you're not going to be worthy. And that's what I really hope folks are getting the invitation to start to be curious about, is that when they notice themselves in those patterns of perfectionism and working all the time and not wanting to take rest and all of those oppressive lessons that we have learned over time, that what is being triggered is something that's deep inside you, that shadow side of you, which love shadow work, that's getting triggered, saying you're not enough. You're not enough. So keep doing. Yeah. When you were talking about perfectionism, of course, it made me think of imposter syndrome, which is, again, the course that I took that you offer on Insight Timer. And it's something that I work with my clients on a lot. It's something that I felt a lot as an attorney. And I also never really felt like I belonged as an attorney. That was different from feeling like I was an imposter. So I see all of these as very much related: the perfectionism, the imposter syndrome, the not enoughness. So let's dive into imposter syndrome a little bit. And I want to start actually first with just the phrase itself, because that's something I've been reading a little bit more about. And I think other people are sort of getting curious about, is why do we call it a syndrome, first of all? Can we call it like phenomenon or something? So I just want to ask you, how do you define imposter syndrome? And do you like that phrase, imposter syndrome, or do you think we should move toward calling it something else?
Yeah, so I like the definition of imposter syndrome that I talk about. I did not come up with, but I talk about is feeling like a fake or fraud despite evidence of high achievement. And I think I was listening to something recently, and I think the original the psychologists, the two female psychologists who kind of first described imposter syndrome, I think they did call it imposter phenomenon. I think my first response is like, I don't really care what we call it.
Right. cares about the
Joe,
labels
and
once
it's, for
again.
me, it's not
Yeah.
like I get it, right? Like I think some people push back on it because they're like, we shouldn't be diagnosing people, and like I think it is a problem when someone outside of you is saying, oh, you just have imposter syndrome and you just have to deal with that, right? Like, and I think a lot of the pushback on it comes from that space of like, we shouldn't just be telling women, people who have been marginalized, like, you have to deal with your imposter syndrome and that's all about you and good luck with that, you know, and sort of pathologizing people. And so I think when it's used in that way, it's very problematic.
Yes.
For me, it's just like a descriptor. I mean, it's sort of like how I think about a lot of diagnoses, and imposter syndrome is not a diagnosis. It's not in the DSM. It's not, you cannot get diagnosed with imposter syndrome, right? And so I think of it just, I'm like, this is the phrase we use and I'm not particularly attached to it, but it also doesn't like hit me like, oh, you're pathologizing me. So I think, you know, to be sensitive to people who are like, I don't want to be pathologized, or people who take it as like, oh, I have imposter syndrome, something is wrong with me, then that's not helpful. I think what's useful, I also will say, I also disagree with the people who are like, imposter syndrome is totally an external problem and there's nothing you need to do about it and there's nothing you can do about it. Because I'm like, well, I've been a therapist and I've worked with people and heard about their thoughts and the way they treat themselves, and I'm not going to tell somebody, well, just sit around and wait until society fixes itself and people are not biased and then hopefully you'll feel better. Like, no, let's actually use some tools that are going to help you in the process. And you know what I mean? So I actually think it's like, it's the both. We need to acknowledge the societal structures, biases, oppression, all of those things that feed into imposter syndrome. And we also need to acknowledge and help people with the internal psychological things that make them feel like they're not good enough.
Yeah. I'm glad that you mentioned that, because it gets to be both, right? Like, this is what we are dealing with when we are talking about working within systems of oppression while still trying to heal ourselves, right? We can't sit around and wait for the systems to be corrected. We need to start working with ourselves so that we can show up, as you said in the beginning, live our fuller lives, truly love ourselves so that we can love and support and help other people too. And that can be what will eventually start to change the systems of oppression. So it's all kind of
Yes.
linked together. The other thing I appreciated about what you said in terms of, you know, looking at the external conditions as well as the internal thoughts and feelings that are coming up when you feel like a fake or a fraud or imposter. And coming back to my experience as an attorney, like, I noticed both of those. I think for me, because something in me knew it wasn't where I belonged from a purpose standpoint, not from a ability standpoint. I could do the job, but from a purpose standpoint, it wasn't where I belonged. I think that fed then into, because I didn't know at the time, I didn't have the language, I'd done this kind of deep self work, that led to then me really feeling like a fake or a fraud, like I couldn't do the job, and that I wasn't as good as people who'd gone to Ivy League schools and been on law review and clerked for federal judges of the Supreme Court, you know, all of those things. And so I did always feel like I was trying to make up for that. And that is something that I then internalized a lot more and felt like I was a fake or a fraud, when in reality, I just wasn't listening to the feedback of, this isn't where you really belong. And so for me, one of the big takeaways is that if you're somebody who feels like a fake or a fraud, look at the external circumstances, first of all, and get curious about, well, what feedback is this telling me about me? And is this where I'm meant to be? And also, what are some of the deeper internal belief systems and patterns and habits that are going on that makes me think that I don't belong? So there's a lot wrapped up into that. I wanted you to speak too about, there was something I remember on the Insight Timer course that I took where you talked about stereotype threat, which I thought was really informative, and I hadn't heard of that before. So can you tell us a little bit more about what stereotype threat is and how that shows up?
Yeah, so stereotype threat is a phenomenon that was, I would say, most widely researched and published on by a social psychologist named Claude Steele. He's a Black social psychologist. He wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi that is about this phenomenon, and it's like for the general public. So it's an easy read. But basically, stereotype threat is the phenomenon where the stress of being negatively stereotyped, based on the stereotypes of your group, where that stress actually interferes with your performance. So a classic research example of this is women who are high achieving in math. So they took two groups of women, college level math. They were really high achieving in math, and they gave them a math exam. And in one condition, they gave the women the math exam, just like you take a standardized test where you have to fill in the bubbles of your name, your gender, all of those things. And they gave them the exam. And then the other condition, they gave the women the same math exam, but they told them, you know how some math exams show gender differences because there's a stereotype that women are not good at math. That's an aside. They didn't say that to the women, but you know how some how some math tests show gender differences. This one doesn't show any differences, right? So what they found is in the first condition, those women underperformed based on their grades, based on the level of math classes that they were taking. They underperformed when they had to fill in. Basically, they were primed to think about their gender by having to fill in that bubble. In contrast, the women in the second condition who were told this math exam actually doesn't show any gender differences, they performed at their expected level, right? So the idea is just having the mental load of worrying that someone may stereotype you, right? I'm not articulate enough. I'm not, whatever it is. I'm not smart enough. I'm not articulate enough. I'm not whatever. That stress, that mental load interferes with your ability to do what you are capable of doing, right? And I think it's really important to talk about that in the context of imposter syndrome, because if you are experiencing stereotype threat and then not doing as well, so not speaking up in the meeting and being like, I have the answer, or I don't have the answer to the question, but I know this, and I read the brief, or I prepared, or I did this, but then I freeze in the moment. And right, like if you're having that sort of experience and then you start to think, maybe I'm not capable. I don't know, but I can't do it here. I'm not performing. Maybe I shouldn't be here, right? Then it reinforces this idea of like, maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I really am an imposter and I can't do this work, right? Which may be combined with also being stereotyped and also being judged and also being, discriminated against or whatever it is. And so it's important for people to know and name like, oh, I'm actually carrying an extra mental load because I'm the only woman in this space. I'm the only Black person in this space. And that's putting me on edge. And so if I'm having more trouble speaking up, answering questions, doing whatever, that's not because I'm not capable. It's because I am carrying this additional mental load, which is not my fault. It's because of society. And unfortunately, I have to deal with it, but I don't have to blame myself for it.
Yeah, I don't have to blame myself for it or feel shame about it, that it's been something that society has put upon me that I have absorbed, and I don't need to feel shame about that. I think that's really critical. And that kind of segues into the topic of shame, because in my experience, there can be a lot of shame that gets in our way of making a transition in something that we want in our life. Shame over how we've done things in the past, shame about, well, too much time has passed, I'm too old now, I should have known better, like all of these things and ways that shame can get in the way. And so when we're dealing with shame, what do you find is a good sort of entry point into helping people to face and confront any shame that they might be feeling that's getting in the way of them fully embracing their self-worth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, often that work is connected to self-forgiveness, because often when we're feeling shame, and even if it's shame because, somebody sexually assaulted us, right? Like we are often, either taking on some messages from society that make us feel blame or shame, or we're blaming ourselves, we're shaming ourselves. And so I think the work of self-forgiveness can be really powerful. And it's a process that I include in my coaching programs because I think it helps with this, because there is often a thing that we have done or we have gone through that we think, yeah, other people may be unconditionally worthy, but not me, right? Like I did that thing. I went through that thing. I said that thing. Someone did that thing to me. And so it's off the table for me, right? Like I that's it, right? And so that process of self-forgiveness is really about, first of all, looking at the facts of the situation. Like what happened? What was the context? Because often when we're blaming ourselves and feeling ashamed, we're like looking back at our 25-year-old self and thinking, well, why didn't I know better? And I can't believe I did that. And it's like, well, you were 25, right? And like your brain just finished developing as an adult, and you were under all of this stress, and right, like there's often so much context that we ignore, right? So first of all, it's looking at like, could you even be compassionate with yourself and see the context that led to the mistake, that led to this experience? Could you acknowledge that somebody doing this awful thing for you wasn't your fault at all, right? And so we like work through that. And then we actually acknowledge like, what is the hurt that you experienced as part of that situation? Because we so often jump to blaming ourselves to, we live in a country that is very carcerally oriented, right? Like punishment, throw you away,
Punishment.
lock away
Yep.
the key, right? And we tend to do that to ourselves too.
Hey, Gen Xer. Chances are, if you're listening to this podcast, you've noticed something is a little off in your life. I know sometimes it can feel like someone threw you on a merry-go-round that keeps spinning round and round while you're screaming, "Let me off of this thing." Or maybe you're just waking up every morning with this low-grade sense of drudgery about what's on your plate for the day. Or you might even feel this constant weight of overwhelm, like being sandwiched between taking care of kids and your parents, or working in a job you hate while wondering what your purpose is, or just trying to survive the grind every day while worrying about your health. Look, whatever it is, I want you to know that I see you. I've been there, and I'm still there on a lot of days, quite honestly. And a few years ago, things had gotten so bad for me that I was at my breaking point. I couldn't bear getting out of bed in the morning. And if it weren't for my dog Winnie, I probably wouldn't have. Something had to give, but I just didn't know what that was or where to start. But slowly I did start with little things, and gradually I shifted my life into the direction that makes me want to get out of bed every day. It's still a work in progress. There's no magic to this, and I'm still learning every day. But because I might just be a couple of steps further down the path than you, I want to share what I've learned with you, because whether you've hit your breaking point or not, I know that there are some simple, practical things that you can do to get off that freaking merry-go-round. This is why I created my Gen X Shift program. It's the best of the work that I've done for myself and with my clients. It's not going to change your life overnight. Let's be real. It's not even going to fix everything in 6 months, but it will show you where to start. It will give you the tools and knowledge to know the next steps to take. And it'll give you accountability around making some of the changes that you want to make in your life. But most of all, it will give you hope. It will give you hope that change is possible. If that sounds like a way to get off that merry-go-round or get out from underneath that weight of overwhelm, then check out lifefromthesummit.com/Gen X Shift program to learn more, or shoot me an email at podcast@lifefromthesummit.com and we'll chat. Remember, podcast listeners get 10% off. All right, now back to the show.
Right? And so we throw ourselves away. And so it's like, could you actually acknowledge how much hurt and pain you experienced as a result of this thing or these things that happened, right? And actually attend to that with care and compassion. And then what's the wisdom that you learned, right? What did you carry forward with you, and what do you want to carry forward with you? And then are you ready to release it, right? And some of that looks like, is it serving you to hold on to this shame, right? Or how is it holding you back, right? Like, how are you keeping yourself from love and connection and the things that you want in your life because you're punishing yourself? You've given yourself a life sentence for this mistake you made or this failure you endured. And is that reasonable to serve out a life sentence of shame because you were human? Right. And so we sort of go through that process of really actually looking at it and forgiving it and offering ourselves compassion to help to release it.
I think there's been such a misconception around forgiveness. And I've even seen some things on social media lately that, at least for me, excuse me, sort of muddy the waters around what at least I think forgiveness really is. And some of those things, especially when we're talking about forgiving other people, is around the notion of you don't have to forgive. And I personally get a little concerned about that. I don't ever like to tell anybody they have to do anything. But the messaging of you don't have to forgive anybody, or you don't have to forgive yourself, to me, what gets lost in that is what I feel like the true definition of forgiveness is it's not about letting off the hook or not having accountability. As one of the authors, podcasters I listen to, Rob Bell, he defines forgiveness as letting someone go and realizing that the person that you set free, setting somebody free, and realizing that the person you set free is yourself. And that's what I'm hearing, and what you're saying about forgiveness for ourselves is it's setting ourselves free. It's not about letting us off the hook. It's kind of the opposite. It's about taking responsibility and autonomy for what we can take responsibility and autonomy for, getting the feedback from that, and moving forward from a place of compassion for ourselves or for somebody else. So I think there's a lot of misconceptions around forgiveness.
The misconception is that you're letting someone off the hook, that you're
Mhm.
letting yourself off the hook, right? You're not taking accountability. And when in fact, it just releases you from the burden, right? Like that burden, and you can still take responsibility. You can still ask for accountability, and you can learn the wisdom instead of, hiding the shame.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's a much more powerful invitation than thinking that you have to forgive someone else or yourself as a way of like letting them off the hook. Yeah. Yeah. That's as I was wanting to get into that topic of forgiveness, because it's one of the steps that you have in your free download. And I don't want to tell all the steps because I want people to download it, but it's the first one that you have in there is forgiveness. And I love how you just explained it and how you talk about it in the guide. So I hope that folks download that so they can use that. All of these topics are kind of leading to a bigger topic that has been a real point of learning for me over the last several years. And it's the topic of trauma. And I have started to do my own learning about how trauma might be showing up in my life and as well as in other people's lives and my clients' lives, and just trying to be more trauma informed myself. And for me, it's been about realizing that there are ways that trauma has impacted my self-worth, probably that I still don't even fully realize. And one of the most profound things that I've gotten really curious about is intergenerational trauma. And I learned about this first through reading Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands, which I highly recommend for folks to read. And he talks about intergenerational trauma, as well as the science that shows us that we can actually see how trauma changes the sperm and an egg of a mom and a dad if it's not healed, and how that can show up, in children, and how it gets passed on generation after generation. And so I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit about intergenerational trauma as well as lived experience, direct trauma that we experience in our lives, and the role of trauma in healing our self-worth issues.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, My Grandmother's Hands is a powerful book. I think intergenerational trauma, it's both, right? Like there's a number of ways that trauma gets passed through, right? We know in utero, when a mother or a gestating person is experiencing trauma that impacts the uterus and impacts the fetus in utero. We know that certain genes turn off and on depending on trauma that has been endured and experienced, and that can impact, can impact the eggs and the sperm and all of those things. So there's those sort of like genetic biological ways. And then we know that when you're stressed and you've experienced trauma, that's going to impact your interpersonal interactions. It's going to impact your parenting. It's going to impact family dynamics, right? So there's also these sort of interpersonal ways, right? Like there's ways of doing things. And I think Resmaa Menakem says, it was like, it's like unhealed trauma that like gets set in can become personality, right? Like it's just like
Yeah.
it can get
Yeah.
so set in, and that's like how you interact. And so there's a lot of ways. But when I think about like the legacy of, my ancestors, so I'm an African American woman and my dad's Jamaican, but on both sides, I have enslaved ancestors. And just thinking about some of these messages, and even thinking about how that connects to what we're talking about with rest, right? So the message is you are more valuable when you are working and producing. And literally, the value of your life, the worth of your life as a human is dependent on how much cotton you can pick, how much whatever sugarcane you can shuck, how much, right? Like there's these direct links and these messages of lack of safety if you rested, lack of safety if you weren't working, if you weren't producing, this sense that anybody could be, anybody you love could be taken from you, could be killed, right? Like all of these legacies, right, are very much passed down historically, intergenerationally, and then we still have the direct impact of racism and all of those things. And so I think one of the things, and this is why, in my sort of like framework, I talk about freeing yourself, is just like naming is really powerful, and understanding where some of these legacies come from and how they have impacted us is really powerful, because we have a tendency to say, it's my fault. It's all me. I am to blame, right? Like, and so just even starting to say like, no, this is societal, this is historic, this is intergenerational, helps us to sort of like loosen up some of those stories and not blame them on ourselves, but see how they have impacted us with compassion, right? Offer ourselves compassion, because that's another big piece, right? I also talk about love yourself, right? Which is like, how do we accept ourselves and love ourselves and show ourselves compassion with whatever is coming up, right? Like, how do we meet and greet whatever we are experiencing, whatever the impacts of our trauma, the outgrowth, the responses to our trauma are, with compassion and love and care, right? And then we move into, in my framework, so it's free yourself, love yourself, and then be yourself, which is really about, okay, and now who do you want to be? Like, what cycles do you want to break? What is no longer serving you? What is no longer working for you? How can you start to move forward in your life in a way that does feel aligned, so that you don't just feel controlled by the specific trauma that you experienced or witnessed, the trauma that was passed down, right? But how do you start to say, okay, this is who I am and who I want to be in the world? I am not beholden or stuck in some of these trauma cycles that I may have inherited.
I'm glad you brought in the third part of your framework, because I know we got off on some tangents. And so I just want to summarize for folks that the 3-part framework is free yourself, love yourself, and be yourself. And I think for a lot of people of my generation and older generations too, there's a hesitancy to want to do this kind of self-work for a number of reasons. One of which is that we don't want to look at that stuff. It's just scary. It's uncomfortable. All the reasons that you said, including when we're talking about trauma. That's such a deep well that I think is very uncomfortable and scary for people to want to look into. And I think the invitation here, from what I've heard and everything that you have said, is that there are ways to do this incrementally, do it in a way that feels comfortable and safe. And the biggest reason to do it is because there's so much else for you on the other side of that this is not, I hear a lot, especially people of my generation older, about how people are just using that as an excuse. Like they get some diagnosis, that they get ADHD, or they get some trauma diagnosis or whatever it might be, and then they use that as an excuse to not show up. And that's not what we're talking about here. Again, labels are kind of unuseful in some respects. It's more about just what you're feeling, what you're experiencing, and how can we find a way that might be more supportive for you instead of what you've been doing. And so I encourage people of my generation to really heed the fact that doing this kind of deeper excavation does not mean you're going to be a puddle on the couch. You might, maybe for a little bit, and that can be necessary, but it doesn't mean that you're going to get an excuse to like check out of your life or be an ass or whatever it is. It's about empowering you. So yeah, I want to actually kind of pick a couple of topics that I know people of my generation are struggling with, and I know you work through too, to look at how self-worth or lack thereof shows up in these areas to prevent people from forward momentum. And one of those areas that I know you've been doing a group program with Black women on is dating.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know people of my generation are either like me, still single, never been married, or divorced and back out in the dating world, which is very scary in your 40s and 50s. So how does self-worth show up in our dating and our ability to put ourselves out there and find a partner for us?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think with dating, we can see probably even more than a lot of other spaces like work and other spaces in our life, like how our energy really impacts the experience, right? Like if you're going into dating kind of like, oh my gosh, don't look at me, oh, I don't know, right? Like if that is your energy, or like, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick me, pick me, will you pick me? Am I good enough? Do you like it like this? What about this? What do you want my hair like this? And what about, you know, like that energy, which I've been in both of those places in the past, right?
Yep. Yep.
Really impacts what we attract, who we attract, right? And so if we're going into dating not grounded in our worthiness, we are just so much more likely to feel anxious, right? Like this could manifest as like an anxious attachment, or even avoid it. Like I can't even let people get close to me, right? Or like maybe we're close and maybe, like this kind of back and forth, anxious,
Yeah.
avoidant. So in contrast, when we feel confident in ourselves inside out, like from the inside out, the way we walk, the way we carry ourselves, the way we show up in a space is going to be very different and more attractive, right? Like you may attract people in the anxious, scared, I don't know if I'm good enough, desperate place, but those are probably not the people you want to partner with. Like people who are most attracted to you when you are not in your strength, when you are feeling most insecure, when you are struggling the most, like those are not usually people who want to see you in your power and your strength, right? And so the more you can embody this energy of like, I feel good, I look good, I am good kind of thing, that is going to exude an energy that's going to attract people who want that. And you'll also have more fun in the process, right? Like I know that dating is frustrating and difficult and really hard for many people right now. And I
Yep.
think, when we can approach it from a space of like, my life is really good. I love myself. I think I'm pretty great. And I also love partnership. And like, let's see what this person, let's see how it is with this person. Let's experiment. Let's have fun. Then it feels lighter than, oh, I'm single. I don't want to be single. What's wrong with me? I've got to find someone. I'm getting older. Oh gosh, all right, is this going to be the person? Maybe I should, right? Like that that energy is not attractive, right? And I do like to share the story of my my grandmother who, was married for a number of years to my mom's dad. And my mom's siblings. So there were 3 kids and they were married for, I don't know, maybe 20 years, maybe a little longer. But after my mom's dad passed away, she met probably when she was in her 50s, her, like, I think the love of her life. Like, I know she loved my grandfather, but I think she met the love of her life. And he was like a jazz musician and they used to ride by the waterfront in DC. And like, they just had this wonderful partnership. And he would he kept trying to move closer to her. She was like, I'm not getting married again, first of all. Like, I'm not doing that. And she was also like, and we're not living together. But he just like kept moving closer to her. We like moved to her block and then moved to the building across the courtyard and then moved into her building, And I just love that as like this model of like finding love later in life, like doing it on your own terms, like the way you want to do it, right? Not feeling like, oh, I have to get married and we have to do all these things and I have to then become this like, housewife for you. But like, no, like I live my own life. I have my own stuff and like you can be a part of it. That's great. But like, I'm not going down certain paths. So I guess I just share that as a example of hope of like what is possible, and the fact that I do think, when we sort of get our energy together and feel good about ourselves, feel good inside out, that really just impacts who we attract. And then I think there's another element of it. So that certainly was my experience. Like when I was finally like, you know what, like I was in a relationship for 2 years with somebody who did not fall in love with me. And I gave him a lot of time. And then at the end, I was like, wait, what the heck? At the end, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
No, you're the
2
problem.
years. Wow.
Like, I am not the
Yeah.
problem. You are like, I just had this revelation, right? Like it was a culmination of all of this self-worth and feeling unlovable stuff that I had struggled with for so long. And it's like, I needed that to finally be like, wait a minute, I am lovable. Will everyone love me? No, they won't. But am I lovable? Yeah, like I am. And so I realized that, and I met my husband 6 months later because it just shifted how I dated. And I dated a couple of other guys who like really good resumes, interesting guys. I like them. They both kind of complained that I wasn't into them enough because I was kind of like, yeah, you're interesting, but like my energy was all different. It was all different, right? Like these were like attractive, accomplished. I think they were both lawyers, like whatever. But I was just like, yeah, like you're cool. But I wasn't like in the way I had been before, right? So that's one thing. But then the other piece that shifts is who you are attracted to. Because when we are in the mode of having to prove that we are worthy and needing to find someone to prove that we are worthy, we are more likely to be attracted to someone who is going to make us work for it, and who is not going to give us that unconditional love and acceptance, and who we feel like,
that was me.
Maybe I do. And if you are an overachiever or a high achiever, all of that energy of like going for the job and going for the promotion, all of that gets stirred up, and we can confuse that for chemistry. Right? Because we're like, oh, maybe if I do this, maybe, right? And so what also shifted for me was, I actually like someone who's available. I actually like someone who's just showing up for me and like taking me on dates, and I don't have to chase him, and I don't have, right? And so these internal shifts impact your energy and who you attract, and they also impact who you're attracted to.
Yeah. A couple of things with that. And of course I'm like raising my hand. I'm like, that's me. One of the last things that I heard you say is that sort of when we've traditionally been in that like anxious attachment, like trying to prove ourselves and like do all the right things, wear all the right things, act all the right ways. When we find somebody who doesn't ask that of us or require that of us, that can actually feel uncomfortable. So it comes back to what you said at the beginning. And I just want to flag that for especially women who are listening to this, that it can feel uncomfortable, discombobulating, and like, oh, this isn't the relationship for me, if there's actually like calmness to it. If you don't have to prove yourself to this person, that is going to be much different from all the relationships where you had to prove yourself. And so you might be like, oh, nope, there's something wrong here because I'm not having to prove myself. So you want to really listen to your energy. And this is why it's so important to do the work with you on your self-worth, so that you can acknowledge that and realize, oh, this is actually what a healthy relationship looks like. And that's going to feel weird because I'm not used to that.
Right.
And the other thing that was coming to mind, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it may also feel boring.
Yes. Yeah. Cause it's like and I'll speak for myself. We love that dopamine hit of getting the approval, like doing the thing, working really hard, and then getting the stamp of approval. And then that dopamine hit, the level of that just keeps getting raised. And so if somebody's not giving that to us, that feels super boring. And boring is good.
Yes.
It can be good. Yeah. The other piece that was coming to me was just people pleasing, right? Like, I think if we don't have a lot of self-worth, we're people pleasers and we're fixers. Like those are two energies I noticed showing up in myself a lot in my dating history, is like finding the projects to date so I could fix them, because then if I fixed them, that meant I was worthy, right? And like the people pleasing, doing everything to please him, don't upset him, don't get him like angry, don't have an argument, all those kinds of things. And those are just a couple of ways, at least for me, that my lack of self-worth showed up in relationships. And so I know I'm not alone in that too. So
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think the fixing thing, right? Sometimes well, maybe always it's easier to focus on fixing someone else over focusing on our own stuff, right? And
Yeah.
it's like it is a project, it is, and I do think we sort of erroneously believe, okay, maybe if I fix them, I'll be worthy and then they'll stay with me. But what is more likely to happen is that you're going to quote unquote fix them and they're going to leave and then you're going
Yep.
to be upset
Yep.
because they're going to, go to someone else. Or you'll get a dynamic where you feel like, let's just say it's a heterosexual couple, right? And you're a woman and you're fixing a man. You may get like a mother-son dynamic, which isn't very sexy, right? Like, and that's not
No.
really what you want in the long run. So then you end up with this funky, unsexy, maybe sexless dynamic in your relationship, which doesn't feel good. And then the people pleasing,
Hmm.
right? There's a sense of like, and women are totally socialized into this, but there's the fear of if I ask for what I want, maybe they'll leave me. And the deal is, and I actually talk to a lot of female clients who are like, I don't want to be needy. And I think sometimes we think if you have any needs, you're needy, right? Like that's what society has sort of socialized us into. Any needs means you're needy.
Hmm.
And it's like, no, that's not needy. And if your needs are not getting met consistently over time in the relationship, that's not the right relationship for you, right? But then there's this idea of like, well, maybe I'll just do everything he wants until we like get married and then it's going to magically change. Guess what? You have just signed up for a relationship where you never get your needs met, right? And so it's like really not setting yourself up well. And it is vulnerable to ask for what you need. And it is scary because maybe they will say no, maybe they won't be able to meet your needs, but it would be better to learn that earlier and make decisions, honest, open decisions about the relationship than to pretend that you don't have any needs. And then you're way deep in and you start asking for something and they're like, what do you mean? You want me to do something? That's not the agreement we had.
Right. Right. Yeah. You've changed the tables around, and then, well, you might get divorced down the road. So the big takeaway for me in all of this is that if you're a Gen Xer who's out in the dating world, the first step before you even get on an app or go out to try to find somebody is to really do the work around your own self-worth, because I think that will serve you as well as serve your potential partner to get really clear on your unconditional worthiness so that you can show up better in relationship and actually be in relationship with the person that is your match. And I know that you had a program, I don't know if you're still doing it. You specifically had a program for Black women who were looking for love. Do you still have that program?
Yeah, so I did a group in the winter. I'm not doing a group now, but I have started to take individual coaching clients to work through that program, and I'll probably run a
Hmm.
group, sometime in the next 6 months, but I am taking on individual clients to do that work, and they don't have to be Black women.
Okay.
And one of the things I was going to mention that we talked about in the group in the winter was some of the work that we do is this like loving and accepting yourself, because that helps you to get safe, feel good, get regulated in the mode of being loved, being cared for, being accepted, so that when you are dating, you can recognize it, right? You have like a familiarity and it doesn't do the thing that we were just talking about, which is dysregulate you and make you feel like, I don't know, something's off. They're just loving me and I should be suspicious of this, right? Or bore you, right? And so some of that self-work is to actually prepare yourself internally, nervous system wise, to recognize when it is healthy and when it is loving and caring, and to accept and receive that and feel good about it.
Yeah. How can somebody like myself who is single, I'm not dating right now because I don't have time. How can we begin to recognize the messages that we get from society that because we are single,
Mm.
we are not worthy? Like, what's wrong with me? I actually had a dude who I did date a few months ago actually ask me basically what was wrong with me that I had never been married. And I'm like, what's wrong with you? Because you're divorced. Like, why is it there's something wrong with me because I wasn't married? And so I hear that a lot. I'm not married and I don't have kids. So what's wrong with me?
Mm.
And I've done a lot of my own work. And so I recognize that that's their stuff. It's not my
Mm-hmm.
stuff. And yet it still triggers me. It still
Mm-hmm.
triggers that shadow, that self-worth, that not enoughness in me. So how can people, I'm trying to think of even the right question to ask here. Like how do we begin as single people, either because we can't find somebody, or maybe we've made the decision just to stay single? How can we really get more solid in our self-worth so that we can recognize that, no, I'm consciously making the decision to stay single versus I'm too afraid to put myself out there? I think that's my question. So how does my self-worth impact me either making a conscious decision not to date, or it's an unconscious decision out of fear? Does that make sense? That was really discombobulated.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, this core of the question, which is like, is it a fear-based decision or is it an intentional
Yes.
values, internal wisdom oriented decision? And I think some of that is like, what does it feel like, right, in your body when you think
Mm,
about, and I probably wouldn't say when you think about dating, because dating is like, for a lot of people, that's not the fun, the fun part. But when you think about partnership, right, like,
I hate it.
yeah, when
Yeah.
you think about partnership and, deep lasting love with someone, like, does that feel like a yes for you, right? Like, does that feel like something you desire? Or does that feel like something you're like, take it or leave it, right? And sort of really, because there is such societal messages, right? Like, we have come a long way in society, but like, still with a lot of things related to women, we're so antiquated, right? We're so, behind the times. And so there are a lot of messages in society that, like, the ultimate achievements for women are marriage and kids, right? And so it can be easy to unconsciously adopt that as your goals. And I think it's really important to consider, do I really want that? Or what do I really want? Like, and what could it look like? And I think one of the beauties of being a Gen Xer at this time, or, being, kind of in middle age, is that hopefully there are fewer pressures in the same way that you might have felt when you were in your 20s and 30s to, like, better get married and have kids, better get married and have kids in this timeline and blah, blah, blah.
Mhm.
And a little bit more flexibility and freedom to think creatively and consciously about what is it that I actually desire, right? Because
Mhm.
that's really where we get in trouble, when we're unconsciously following the mandates of society without considering what we really want. And so part of the self-worth piece is, like, tapping into what you want, allowing it to be okay, and then believing that you're worthy of it, right? And so it's like, well, what
Mhm.
what is it that I want my life to look like? And you might imagine and be like, I just want to travel the world and live different places, and, like, the idea of having a partner who, like, has a traditional job, and I got to be in a traditional house, and I, like, love, no thanks, right? Like, and you might be like, I want to travel the world, spend months in places, and, like, take on a lover, and, like, then move on, and, like, great. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
kind of really kind of asking yourself the deeper question of, like, what would I like it to look like day to day? What do I want? Right. And that's where the sense of, like, I'm worthy regardless of what I choose is really powerful, because when your worthiness is based on having a partner or being chosen by a partner, and often specifically it's by a man to be their wife, right? Like, when the worthiness is based on that, it cuts you off from that deeper inner sense of what would truly fulfill you, right? And so that's where I encourage, like, if I were just worthy, if everyone thought I was worthy, including me, what would I choose, right? And then think
Mhm.
about what the
Mm.
answer is. And that's where you're going to find that truth.
How would you differentiate between being too picky
Mm,
and standing in what you know you deserve?
that's a good question. I think some of it depends on what you are being picky about. I think often people are picky about external things more than the quality of the relationship or the interactions, right? So I hear people being picky about, how do they look? How tall are they? What kind of job do they have? What kind of car do they have? Where did they live? Right? Like these external things, which can be, where did they go to school? Did they go to school? Which can be markers of values, but are indirect ways to get to them. And I think people are much more picky about that than what are the quality of our conversations? How do I feel when I am with that person? How do we connect? Do I feel cared for? Do I feel respected? Do I feel right? Like that is, to me, those pieces, the inside of the interaction and the connection, and the respect and the respecting of boundaries and all of those things, that are those things, those are those things to stand firm on, right? You know what? They keep telling me they're going to call. They keep telling me that every time we make a date, they're 30 minutes late. They keep, right? Like those sorts of things that are kind of like, how am I being treated? Do I feel good when I am with this person? Does it really feel good? Do I feel unworthy? Do I feel not good enough? Do I feel judged? Do I feel unseen? They're on their phone the whole time. Or do I feel good? Those are the things to be particular about and stand firm on. The other things, what job they have, where they, where they went to school, the car, all those external things. Like, I'm not saying you can't have any expectations for that, but those are the things where if you're like, well, he's amazing, but he's only 5'8", so I need someone who's 6'2", it's like, okay, girl, like, have fun with that. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, do you really want to, because then we get back to that bigger question. Do you really want a partner? Or do you want someone who's going to look good in pictures on Instagram? Right? And if you right?
That was a mic drop right there. Yeah.
So it's like, and then if you're picking at them, then is it anxiety? Is it fear? Is it, right? Like, what's going on? Like, that's where we gotta like dig a little deeper, right? Dig a little deeper than the surface of like, well, he just isn't blah, blah, blah. And he just doesn't dress that well. And And it's like, okay, well, I thought you said you wanted a lifetime partner with someone you could travel the world with and build a beautiful life with. And it seems like he really wants to travel. He has the money to travel. But he wears cargo shorts and you don't like him. Okay.
That's a great distinction. Yeah. And I know I've been guilty of that myself. I know other people have too. And I know for me, a few years ago when I had a breakup that really kind of rocked my world, I spent some time actually sitting and coming up with, I spent significant time, a couple of days, coming up with my core values. And values are something I preach all the time. And I think they're very much related to self-worth, because I came up with the core values for my life, and that also translates into my dating life, so that I know the 5 things that are deeply important to me, that make me tick, that light me up, that are non-negotiable in my life. And so when it comes to dating, it's not that the person has to have those same values. It's that I have to be able to stand true in those and not feel like I'm sacrificing my values, i.e. my self-worth, in this relationship. And so they became like kind of little, I don't like to say like a checklist, but like little warning lights that, for example, compassion is one of my values. If we're at a restaurant and the dude I'm with is rude to the waitstaff, probably not going to work, because that's just another indicator for me of things that could potentially trigger my value of compassion. And I think that's just another message to get really grounded in your self-worth, what matters to you, your needs, your desires, and not feel guilty about demanding that those be met, and knowing that you are worthy of having those met, and that it is possible. It might narrow the pool, but it doesn't mean that it's hopeless. And I'm at the point where I would rather be by myself than be with the wrong person, honestly.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
One more topic I wanted to get your thoughts on when it comes to self-worth, and that is at a crossroads where I feel like a lot of Gen Xers are finding themselves lately. I found myself at this a few years ago, which is that crossroads of, I don't know that I am fully living into my purpose, especially when it comes to careers. And a lot of people just wanting to stick it out in their career because Gen Xers are loyal. We feel like we should. We don't job hop like younger generations. And we want to stick it out for retirement. There's a lot of ways that we end up sacrificing ourselves in our careers for a number of reasons that end up impacting our purpose. And so for somebody who's hesitant to make a career shift, or maybe dump their job and start their own business, whatever it might be. How is self-worth potentially getting in the way of you finding your greater purpose in life?
It's a good question. I think if self-worth is attached to working at a certain company or organization, having a certain title, having a certain salary, then it makes it harder to leave. And, I had done a lot of self-worth work before I left my last job. And I still felt ooh, I used to be able to say that I worked at this university. I used to be able to say that I was a faculty member. I used to be able to say that I had this sexy title, right? And I felt that ooh, that was a little bit of I don't know if you know Pema Chodron, but she talks about groundlessness, right? It was ooh, a little groundlessness, a little bit more groundlessness. Some of the ground, some of the ooh, this is a foundation. People ask me, oh, what do you do? Oh, I work at blah, 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 and blah, blah, blah. And it feels good, right? And people recognize it. And so and I know that being grounded in my self-worth and knowing that that wasn't what made me worthy, even though it boosted my self-esteem, helped me to make that leap, right? Helped me to say, okay, and I trusted myself and what I feel I'm being called to do more than this, institution and the salary and all of those things. And so I think the first thing is just kind of considering, it's sort of similar to the question with dating. If everyone was going to think you were worthy regardless, what would you want to be doing? Right? What would you want to do? Right? If your self-worth wasn't at stake, what would you do? And I think also considering you creating a sense of meaning, some of that could be professional. It doesn't have to be, right? If your job is taking up all of your space and time and energy, it may even be thinking how do I set some boundaries around work such that I have more space and time and energy outside of work to do something that feels meaningful for me? For some people, it may be this is untenable and I am dying here. And so I need to leave. And so how do I create the courage? I think it's really important for people to remember that you have been doing the work. Your job has not, it's not when you leave an organization or institution, you lose all of your skills, all your talents, all your gifts, all your wisdom, all your insight, right? And I think people often fear that because they put all of themselves into this job and feel if I leave it, I lose everything. Well, yeah, you may lose the title and you may lose some of the status associated with working there, and you may lose it, you're probably going to lose the salary. But you still have you still have your gifts, you still have your insights, you still have your experience, you still have your wisdom. And so remembering that as well, not ascribing all of your worth to this organization or institution and feeling like you're nothing without it. But instead remembering that you are still worthy, you still have gifts, and you take those with you for whatever else you might do.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially I'll speak for attorneys and myself, that there can be such an identity attached to what we do. And there can be a fear that if we don't do that anymore, then who am I? And really the question underneath that is, what am I worth? So we get our self-worth wrapped up in the identity of the particular job. And to really have the recognition, as you were saying, that no matter what the job is, the title, that's not who you are. It doesn't have anything to do with the fact that you are human and you are deserving to be here and deserving of love and deserving of a life that lights you up. I remember, and I hear this all the time, when I became an entrepreneur, somebody said that being an entrepreneur will dig up all the unhealed shit that you have had in your life. And that is 100% true. All of my worthiness issues when it comes to money, just about myself and my purpose and why am I here and my abilities, all of that gets triggered in being an entrepreneur. And so just again, these repeated invitations to lean into my self-worth. And so I think for Gen Xers who are feeling like they can't make a career change at this stage of life, because we are getting closer to retirement age for some, I haven't, still retirement, not really on my radar. But if we're feeling like we can't really make a shift because it's too late, we really want to, I love your question of, what would you be doing if people would think you were worthy regardless? I think that's a beautiful place to start, is asking yourself that question. I wanted to ask you, you co-authored a book that's called Promoting Black Women's Mental Health. Who did you co-author that book with?
I co-authored it with my good friend and colleague. Her name is Donna Baptiste. She's
Uh-huh.
well, she's a psychologist, and she was like over at Northwestern for a while. She's about to transition, but heading up their counseling program, their master's of counseling program.
Yeah. Can you tell us just a little bit about that book? And I'll make sure to include a link to it in the show notes too.
Yeah, so it's promoting Black women's mental health, what practitioners should know and do. So it's a little bit more oriented towards practitioners, but we also feel like it's a book that people in general could pick up and read. Like, hopefully it's not overly academic. We have some personal experiences there, case studies, all of those things, but it's really about helping people to understand the nuanced experiences of Black women. Often Black women are either painted as people who are like struggling and experiencing all these challenges and all of these awful things, or as like superhuman, magical, always strong, always got it together, right? And so our intention was to acknowledge all of it and everything in between, right? Acknowledge the very real challenges that Black women experience, right? From a societal level, an interpersonal level, an intrapersonal level, and also acknowledge the strengths and acknowledge the gifts and those sorts of things, and provide tools for Black women and for mental health practitioners specifically to support Black women in healing and growing and all of that stuff.
Yeah, that sounds like a really helpful book. I'll make sure and include that because I think that it kind of comes back to what you said in the beginning about the psychology profession and therapy, and sort of not pathologizing people, and really taking each individual as they are and recognizing particular circumstances that have impacted them culturally, societally. And so having that knowledge as a therapist, I think is really important. And that reminds me too of something I wanted to ask in terms of just therapy or counseling in general. I know, myself included in this, a lot of people of my generation are very resistant to getting support or help because we have these external expectations to be these rugged individualist people who can just take care of everything ourselves, right? Especially like I was a latchkey kid. I'm very self-sufficient, very independent. I don't need somebody to help me. I'll just Google it or read a book and figure it out myself. When it comes to these issues of self-worth, which are very deeply ingrained and involve a lot of excavation, what would you say to somebody who is resistant to getting the help or support of a therapist, a counselor, a coach, and why it would be important to get help to do that kind of work around your self-worth?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I want to say is, hey, Gen Xers, you're actually going to be the one doing the work. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this
I love
idea
that.
that like you getting help means is going to be like you're not working, you're not doing the work. Like, you have to do the work. And that's actually harder than avoiding it. It actually is harder to face your fears, your shadows, your challenges, your traumas than it is to just avoid and numb out and, all the ways that people numb out. And so, when I'm doing work with someone in the therapy room or, I'm coaching them, I am a support and a guide, but think of it as like climbing up a mountain, right? Hiking up a mountain. If you get a guide to hike up the mountain, the guide does not hike for you. The guide just says, hey, I know a path here. Hey, here's a good place to rest. Hey, let's drink some water and get some nourishment and eat here, right? Like, let's get a snack. We're getting tired. Hey, don't go down that route. It's really not going to lead you anywhere but back to the bottom, right? Like, that's what a guide does for you on the hike. They do not hike for you. They do not take you on their back and hike up the mountain for you. And so I think it's really helpful to understand that. So, Gen Xers who are like, I want to do the work and I want to work hard, this will help you do that, right? So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is, it's really easy to stay in our heads and have intellectual exercises around our challenges, right? that can be a safe space, especially for, high achievers, type A folks. But the work that we do in therapy, the work that we do around self-worth is really embodied work. It is about getting into your body and living differently. And it can be hard to do that, to make those shifts when you're just reading a book or when you're just thinking about something by yourself. And, you may choose a silent meditation and have everything come up through that and work through it that way, right? Like there's a lot of ways you can do this work, and having guides, if you're hiking up a really intense mountain, is incredibly helpful. It also helps you get there quicker, right? Like you still have to do the work, but it's like, okay, would you like to wander around this mountain for 5 years, not knowing which direction, not knowing which berries to eat and which ones are poisonous, right? Like, do you want to go that route, or would you like someone to help you, right? So I think that metaphor really highlights that it's like, it is not an easy path. It's an incredibly courageous path, right? It is a path of somebody who's committed to their life, to living life better, to feeling better, and to showing up more whole for everybody in their world. So I think that's what I'd say.
That hiking metaphor really hits home for me, and I think it will for a lot of other people too, because that really flips the script, and at least for me, takes the wind out of some of that messaging that I'm not worthy if I have to go get support and help for this. I mean, there's sort of that weird little loop there that I'm only worthy if I can do my healing work all by myself, right?
Yeah.
And that's just we're not meant as humans to do everything by ourselves. We're meant to be in community. We're meant to support and get support from others. We're not meant to do everything by ourselves. It's great to do some things on our own. Absolutely. It can help build your self-worth to do some things on your own, but not everything. And especially when it comes to your own internal healing, that's where we really need to get support. We covered a lot of ground. I'm just checking my notes to see if we kind of missed anything, but that was a lot of territory. Speaking of like hiking, we just like climbed a metaphorical Everest with all of that. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to mention?
I don't think so. I think that was pretty thorough.
Yeah. Well, we're gonna do just a little modified lightning round.
I do think I thought of a song though, so I can do it. We'll see.
We were just talking beforehand, and this is why I give people the lightning round questions ahead of time, because I do not want to cause anxiety for people by putting them on the spot with the lightning round questions. And Dr. Adia was saying she hadn't come up with a song yet, but if you've come up with a song, we'll still do it. So, okay, all right, we'll give it a shot here. So, what is your fondest childhood memory?
That's a good question. I'm gonna say going on a camping trip in Mulegé, which is in Baja California, with my classmates. I told y'all I went to a hippie elementary school, so we used to go on camping trips and like camping on the beach and digging for clams and swimming in the Sea of Cortez, which was just like an incredible experience as an 8th grader.
That sounds way more fun than what I did as a little kid, basically. So that sounds awesome. What is your biggest piece of advice for Gen Xers who are facing any kind of transition in their life?
Be patient and compassionate with yourself. It's hard to not know what you're doing. It's hard to not know what's going to happen, especially when you are used to that, when you've been doing something for decades, right? When you're the expert, when you're, the one who knows it, to be transitioning and to not know how to do everything and to not know how it's going to turn out is really hard. And usually that just lasts for a period, but we really need compassion and care and patience for ourselves during that time.
That's amazing advice. And I think compassion could be an entire podcast series in and of itself, especially for people of my generation. So, okay, what is your favorite word or phrase from growing up?
I think I'm going to say, this is a very Bay Area thing, but I think I'm going to say like hella. Like, so in the Bay Area, we used to say, like, I went to Stanford for undergrad, so we used to like, that's hella good, hella, like that was our like descriptor. So it's both time and location specific, but I think I'm going to use that one.
Yeah, I like that word. And what would be the theme song for your life?
Okay, I think I'm going to choose Wipe Me Down. Oh, shoot.
Oh, I don't know that one.
Who is it by? Is it the Franchise Boys? I think I should know who it's by. But it's basically, the reason I'm choosing is because Stanford has this very funny way of doing graduation, and you do the wacky walk. So you can process in however you want. And me and my friends had a big boom box, and we loved this song, Wipe Me Down, which came out our senior year of college. And it's basically like, I'm the shit, wipe me down. Like, yeah, my gas tank may be on E. I may not have a lot of money, but like, I'm buying drinks for everybody, like, wipe me down. So it's just a very like kind of ironic, funny, I'm the shit, but maybe I don't really have all my stuff together. Like, all of that stuff. So I'm going to choose Wipe Me Down.
I think that sounds like the perfect song for somebody who specializes in doing self-worth, because it doesn't matter if your gas tank is empty, if you're broke, still wipe me down.
Exactly.
I'm still worthy.
I love that.
Yeah.
There we go.
I'm gonna have to look that song up. I haven't heard that. I might have heard it. I'm bad with song titles and artists. Sometimes I've probably heard it, but. And then last question: what are you most proud of being a elder millennial?
Ooh. You know what? I'm going to take this sort of from my mom, because we were talking. She was like, elderly millennials are teaching us to rest. And I'm like, I really think that's Gen Z. But she was like, elderly millennials are about balance. Like, there is more to life than work. And I do think we are sort of in that, like, shifting from the like work to like, hey, like, I want to play. I want to do other things. I want to have fun. I want more than just work. And so I am proud to be in that space where we're kind of like, okay, yeah, there is more to life, and we don't just have to follow the path and follow the thing, and we could build our own business, and we could do something different. So I'm proud of that.
Well, and as a Gen Xer, I have taken that cue from the millennial generation. So thank you for living into that vibe. It's been helpful for some of us. All right. So tell everybody where they can find you.
Yeah. So welcome to visit my website, dradiagooden.com. I have, more information if you were interested in like having a quick meeting with me to see if any of my therapy or coaching services might be a good fit. You could book a call there. Those are complimentary. And I'm on IG at Dr. Adia Gooden, and LinkedIn under Dr. Adia Gooden, and would love to connect.
And you didn't mention, and we didn't really talk about this, but your podcast, the Unconditionally Worthy podcast, which I highly recommend. Give us just a brief rundown of we know what the theme is, but sort of the topics you cover and what the podcast is like.
Yeah. So it's really about kind of like a wide range of topics and how they relate to self-worth, right? So the first number of episodes are solo episodes. I think the first season solo, and then I start interviewing people and talking about, self-worth and imposter syndrome, self-worth and leadership, self-worth and lots of other things. So I have really interesting conversations. It's paused right now, but there are 100 episodes that you can listen to. So there's a wealth of recordings and episodes that you could check out. And it's on Apple.
That's awesome.
YouTube, all the places where you can find podcasts, Spotify, just under Unconditionally Worthy podcast.
Yeah, I'll make sure and link that in the show notes too. And I love that you mentioned self-worth and leadership. I think it would be great for folks to find those episodes. I'll go back and look, and if I can find those and link to them too, because that's a big issue. Like, being the leader you want to be in all areas of your life is very much connected to your self-worth, whether we're talking about leadership at work or at home. It all comes back to your self-worth. So I just want to personally thank you for being part of my own self-worth journey in ways that you don't even know, and for all of the amazing resources that you have online, your TED Talk, your course, your Instagram videos, which on a daily basis always serve as some kind of nourishment for me. So thank you so much for all of the help that you have been in ways that you don't even know in my life. And I'm just glad to know you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I really appreciate hearing that. And it's been an honor to support you and enjoy to be on your podcast.
All right. Take care. Thank you.
Thanks.
Man, that conversation with Dr. Adia is just such a powerful reminder, at least for me, about how important it is to continue to do the work around embracing my inherent and unshakable, unconditional self-worth. I hope it planted that seed for you too. And let me leave you with a question, one that Dr. Adia asked. What if your self-worth didn't depend on what other people thought of you, on how much money you make, what your job is, or even who you're with? What if your self-worth only depended on you recognizing that you are a human being who is worthy and deserving to be here because you are alive? Share your reflections on this episode and on those questions with me in the comments on the episode, or shoot me an email at podcast@lifefromthesummit.com. And please remember to like, share, and review the podcast wherever you're listening to it. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you got some wisdom and inspiration out of this conversation, because I know that you are unconditionally worthy, and I want you to believe that for yourself too. So until next time, stay gold, Gen Xers.